Imagine a massive bomber in Avro Lancaster, designed to fly miles high in the sky. Now imagine it thundering through the night just 60 feet above the ground. Its four engines are screaming, so low you could almost touch the treetops. It's not carrying a normal bomb. Hanging underneath is a strange black cylinder, 4 tons of metal and high explosive, spinning backward at 500 revolutions per minute. The target isn't a factory or a city. It's a wall of stone and concrete holding back a vast lake. This was Operation Chastise, the Dam Busters raid of May 16 to 17, 1943. It sounds like something from a work of fiction. But it was real. How did they invent a bomb that could skip across water? How could a pilot possibly hold a 30-ton aircraft steady at exactly 60 feet in the dark while being shot at? How did they aim it with tools made of wood and string? This wasn't just a bombing raid. It was a war fought with slide rules, blueprints, and impossible ideas. It was a story of engineering genius, incredible courage, and devastating consequences. It was a series of problems, each one harder than the last, that had to be solved before a single plane could even take off. Number 16. What was the true human cost? The story of the Dam Busters is often told as a tale of triumph, a brilliant invention, brave airmen, and a stunning victory. But the raid's success came at a price, and that price was paid in human lives. On the night of the raid, 19 Lancaster bombers took off. 8 of them never returned. Of the 133 airmen who flew on the mission, 53 were killed. 3 were captured. That is a casualty rate of over 40%. These men were volunteers, handpicked for their skill. They were some of the best crews in Bomber Command. Their loss was a heavy blow. The personal stories are harrowing. Flight Lieutenant John Hopgood, piloting M. Mother, was hit by anti-aircraft fire on his approach to the Moan Dam. His aircraft was on fire, yet he pulled up to allow his crew to bail out. Only 2 survived. He died at the controls. The crew of P. Popsy, led by Flight Lieutenant Harold Martin, successfully bombed the Moan, but their plane was badly damaged. They limped home, flying just above the waves of the North Sea, a journey that took hours of intense concentration. The cost was not just paid by the aircrews. The purpose of breaching the dams was to cause flooding and disrupt industrial production in Germany's Ruhr Valley. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The torrent of water that surged from the breached Moni and Eder dams was immense. An estimated 330 million tons of water crashed down into the valleys below. It swept away homes, farms, bridges, and factories. The exact number of people killed on the ground is still debated. The official German figures at the time reported 1,294 deaths. More recent research, such as the work detailed in James Holland's book, Dam Busters: The Race to Smash the Dams, suggests the number was likely higher, perhaps closer to 1,600. The water did not distinguish between its victims. They were German civilians, including women and children. Critically, a significant number of the dead were not German. They were foreign forced laborers, men and women from occupied countries like Russia and Poland, who were living in camps situated in the valleys precisely because the land was considered low value. They had little warning and no chance of escape. Their deaths were a direct result of the raid, an outcome that was foreseen, if not specifically intended. The strategic impact itself is a subject of intense historical debate. The physical damage was repaired surprisingly quickly. German engineer and Minister of Armaments Albert Speer organized a massive recovery effort. Thousands of workers were diverted from other projects, including the construction of coastal defenses in France. During his best set, I remember he was being told, he was looking for something. The raid did cause a temporary dip in steel production, but its long-term effect on the war economy was not as decisive as had been hoped. Some historians, like Adam Tooze in The Wages of Destruction, argue that, from a purely economic standpoint, the raid was a failure. The resources spent on developing the bomb, modifying the aircraft, and training the elite squadron were immense. The loss of 8 Lancasters and their expert crews was a significant cost for a result that was quickly negated. However, the raid had another, perhaps more powerful, impact. It was a tremendous propaganda victory for the Allies. At a time when the war news was often grim, the story of the Dam Busters was a ray of light. It was a story of ingenuity and daring, proof that the Allies could strike a precise and devastating blow deep in enemy territory. The news electrified the public in Britain and beyond. It boosted morale at home and sent a clear message to the enemy that no target was safe. It also demonstrated a new kind of warfare, one based on precision and technical superiority. In this sense, the psychological impact may have been far more valuable than the physical damage. It showed that a small, dedicated force could achieve a spectacular result, a concept that would influence military thinking for decades to come. The question of whether the cost was worth the outcome remains. It depends on how one measures value in tons of steel, in military strategy, or in the hearts and minds of a population at war. Was their presence in the valley known to Allied intelligence before the raid? And if so, was it a factor in the planning? Could the German industry have recovered so quickly without the use of that same forced labor? And does that complicate the raid's strategic assessment? And perhaps the most difficult question of all, if the exact human cost on the ground had been known beforehand, would the mission have been approved? Number 15, how did one photo define a war? Before the raid, the dams were just lines on a map. After the raid, they were a symbol, and that symbol was created by a single photograph. On the morning of May 17, 1943, as the surviving crews of 617 Squadron were landing back in Britain, another pilot was taking off. Flying a high-speed unarmed Spitfire modified for photo reconnaissance, Flight Lieutenant Frank Jerry Frey flew over the Ruhr Valley. His mission was to see if the raid had worked. The Spitfire was stripped of all its weapons and armor to make it lighter and faster, its only defense being its speed and the pilot's skill. Frey flew at high altitude, a tiny, vulnerable speck in the sky. When his photos were developed, they caused a sensation. One image in particular became iconic. It showed the Moni Dam, a massive curved structure of stone with a gigantic, jagged hole torn out of its center. A torrent of white water was pouring through the breach, emptying the vast reservoir behind it. The photo was undeniable proof of success. It was more powerful than any report or radio broadcast. You could see the raw power that had been unleashed. The image was immediately circulated at the highest levels of the Allied command. It was shown to Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who was famously impressed. Copies were sent to Washington. It was physical evidence that Barnes-Wallis's eccentric idea had not just worked, but had worked spectacularly. The propaganda value was immense. The photograph was released to the public and printed in newspapers around the world. For people in Britain, who had endured years of bombing and rationing, it was a moment of pure triumph. It was a story of David versus Goliath, of British ingenuity against brute force. The press hailed the pilots as heroes and the raid as a turning point. The story was so compelling that it quickly entered the realm of legend. In 1951, Paul Brickhill, who had been a Spitfire pilot himself, published his book, The Dam Busters. It was a bestseller. In 1955, it was adapted into a major motion picture of the same name. The film, with its stirring musical score and dramatic depiction of the raid, cemented the Dam Busters' place in popular culture. The image of the breached dam became a shorthand for precision, daring, and victory. Beyond the public morale boost, the photo had a significant military impact. It validated the concept of precision bombing. At the time, the dominant theory of air warfare was area bombing or carpet bombing. This involved dropping huge numbers of bombs over a wide area, like a city, in the hope of destroying industry and breaking civilian morale. Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, the head of Bomber Command, was a firm believer in this strategy. He was initially skeptical of the dam's raid, viewing it as a sideshow that diverted precious resources from his main campaign. The success of Operation Chastise and the photographic proof of that success demonstrated that a different approach was possible. It showed that a small number of aircraft with a specialized weapon and highly trained crews could destroy a single vital target with surgical precision. This idea would eventually lead to the development of other precision weapons, like the Tallboy and Grand Slam earthquake bombs, also designed by Barnes-Wallis. These weapons were used to destroy targets that were impervious to conventional bombing, like submarine pens and V-weapon sites. The damage assessment was not limited to that one photo. Reconnaissance flights continued for days, tracking the path of the floodwaters. The photos showed bridges washed away, railway lines submerged, and factories inundated. They allowed analysts to create a detailed picture of the disruption caused. This intelligence was crucial for planning future operations and for understanding the German war economy. The photos told a story of chaos and destruction that helped to shape Allied strategy. The raid became a case study in the effectiveness of attacking infrastructure. It was a stark reminder that a modern industrial nation was a complex system, and that breaking a single link in the chain could have far-reaching consequences. The single photo of the broken dam was the key that unlocked this understanding. It was a quiet, technical piece of evidence that shouted a message of victory to the world. Yet, several questions remain unanswered. How much did the German High Command know about the reconnaissance flights? And did the presence of unarmed Spitfires in the sky above the Ruhr signal something important to them? We know the photograph galvanized the Allies, but how was it truly perceived inside the German leadership as a fluke or as a terrifying new form of threat? How much did the popular narrative shaped by that one photograph overshadow the more complex and ambiguous reality of the raid's long-term strategic effectiveness? Did the power of the image create a myth that was more potent than the truth? Number 14, could. They really hit a tower in the dark. The engineering was brilliant, the planning was meticulous, but in the end it all came down to a few minutes of intense, terrifying action. It came down to a young pilot, a bombardier, and a flight engineer trying to fly a perfect line in the dark while people on the ground tried to kill them. The bombing run itself was the ultimate feat of the raid. It was a sequence of tasks, any one of which seemed impossible. The crews had to approach the dam, a huge wall of stone, at a precise speed of 240 miles per hour. They had to be at a precise altitude of 60 feet. They had to be at a precise distance from the dam wall when they released the bomb, and they had to do it all at night, with no electronic aids, while flying straight and level into a barrage of anti-aircraft fire. The Moan Dam was heavily defended. Machine guns and 20mm cannons were positioned on the towers of the dam itself and on the hillsides around it. As the first Lancaster, piloted by Guy Gibson, made its approach, the defenses opened up. Tracers, which are bullets that burn brightly so gunners can see where they are firing, filled the air. They looked like red and green balls of fire floating towards the aircraft. Gibson described it as flying into a solid wall of light. His bombardier, John Hoppy Hopgood, released the bomb. It skipped across the water as planned and exploded against the dam. But the dam held. Now it was the turn of the next aircraft, M-Mother, piloted by Hopgood. He began his run. The gunners on the ground were now fully alert. They concentrated all their fire on his approaching bomber. The Lancaster was hit repeatedly. An engine caught fire. The wing was ablaze. Hopgood pressed on, determined to drop his bomb. He got too low, and the blast from his own exploding bomb may have been what finally brought the aircraft down. It crashed in a ball of flame. Only 2 crew members escaped. The pressure on the remaining crews was now immense. They had just seen one of their friends shot down in front of them. The third aircraft, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Harold Mick Martin, made its run. The fire was just as intense. His plane was hit, but he managed to release his bomb successfully. The dam still held. Gibson, the squadron commander, now made a critical decision. He realized the German gunners were concentrating on the single attacking aircraft. He decided to draw their fire. On the next bombing run by P. Popsy, Gibson flew his own aircraft alongside it, flying parallel to the dam. There, he switched on his lights and instructed his gunners to fire back at the ground defenses. The idea was to distract the enemy gunners, to make them divide their fire between 2 targets. It was an act of incredible bravery. It worked. The next 2 bombs, dropped by Flight Lieutenant David Maltby and Squadron Leader Melvin Dingy, Young, hit the dam. After the 5th bomb, the dam finally gave way. A huge section of the wall collapsed, and the water of the reservoir began to surge into the valley below. The Etterdam presented a different challenge. It was situated in a deep, winding valley, surrounded by steep hills. There were no anti-aircraft guns, but the geography made the approach almost impossible. The pilots had to dive steeply into the valley, level out at the last second, and then immediately line up for the short run to the dam. There was no room for error. A slight miscalculation would mean crashing into the hills on the far side. Several crews tried and failed to line up correctly, having to circle around and attempt the dangerous dive again. Squadron leader Henry Maudsley made 2 attempts. On his 3rd, he finally released his bomb, but something went wrong. The bomb struck the top of the dam wall and detonated, possibly destroying his aircraft in the blast. A bomb for the next aircraft, flown by Pilot Officer Les Knight, that finally breached the Etter. After the raid, Gibson wrote in his official report about the challenges, noting the difficulty of the terrain and the courage of his crews in making repeated attempts under such stressful conditions. His logbook, now a historical artifact, provides a terse, professional account of the night's events, but the strain is palpable between the lines. Each bombing run was a miniature drama of skill, courage, and luck. It was the final violent exam after months of hard study. All the science, all the engineering, and all the training were focused into those few critical seconds of the final approach. The fact that any of them succeeded is remarkable. The fact that they did so repeatedly after watching their comrades die is one of the most incredible feats of the entire operation. But we still don't know the precise sequence of events on some of the lost aircraft. What exactly happened to Maudsley's plane at the Eder Dam? Was it his own bomb, or did a structural failure occur under the strain of the pull-up? For the crews that were shot down on the way to or from the targets, what were their last moments like? And psychologically, how did the surviving crews process the immense pressure and trauma of watching their friends die while they had to immediately press on with their own attack runs? Number 13, how do you lead men on a suicide mission? An operation like this doesn't just need a brilliant scientist and skilled pilots. It needs a leader on the ground and in the air. That leader was Wing Commander Guy Gibson. He was only 24 years old, but he was already a veteran of over 170 combat missions. He was a highly experienced and decorated pilot. He was also a demanding and at times difficult commander. He was chosen specifically to form and lead the new secret squadron, which would be designated number 617 Squadron. Gibson's first task was to build the squadron from scratch. He was given the authority to select his own crews. He went through the records of Bomber Command and handpicked the best and most experienced pilots, navigators, and gunners he could find. These were men from all over the Commonwealth, from Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. He brought them all to RAF Scampton, a base in Lincolnshire, in March 1943. He had less than 2 months to turn this collection of elite individuals into a cohesive unit, capable of carrying out a mission so secret that even he didn't know the exact targets at first. His leadership style was based on discipline and example. He drove his crews hard. The training was relentless. They practiced low-level flying day after day over lakes and reservoirs in the UK, like the Derwent Reservoir in Derbyshire. Gibson pushed them to fly lower and faster to perfect the skills they would need. He was a perfectionist, and he demanded the same from his men. Some found him aloof and strict, but he also earned their respect. He led from the front. He flew every training exercise with them. He mastered the techniques himself before he expected his crews to. He understood that to ask men to do the impossible, you first have to show them it can be done. His personal pilot's logbook, a key historical document, shows the sheer number of hours he spent in the air during April and May 1943, practicing again and again. On the night of the raid, Gibson's leadership was put to the ultimate test. He was not just another pilot in the formation. He was the master of ceremonies for the entire operation. He flew the first aircraft to attack the Moan Dam. This was a deliberate choice. He wanted to go first to see the defenses and to work out the best line of attack. After his own bomb failed to breach the dam, his role changed. He became the air traffic controller for the battle. He circled high above the dam, out of the main cone of fire, but still dangerously exposed. From this vantage point, he directed the other aircraft in their attacks. He gave them instructions by radio, telling them when to begin their runs and correcting their approach. His voice on the radio, calm and professional amidst the chaos, was a crucial factor in the success of the attack. His most courageous act, as mentioned before, was his decision to deliberately draw the enemy's fire. When he saw how the gunners were concentrating on each attacking Lancaster in turn, he flew his own bomber low and parallel to the dam wall, effectively making himself a target to give the other aircraft a better chance. It was a selfless act of leadership that almost certainly saved lives. After the Moan was breached, he led the remaining aircraft of his formation onto the Eder Dam. He didn't attack it himself, as he had no bomb left, but he stayed to supervise the attack and confirm the result before finally turning for home. For his actions that night, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest award for gallantry in the British Commonwealth. His citation specifically mentioned his cold, calculated courage and his outstanding leadership. Guy Gibson was not just a participant in the raid, he was its architect in the air. He held the entire complex operation together through the force of his will and his personal bravery. But questions about his leadership persist. How did his demanding, sometimes abrasive personality affect the morale of a squadron formed under such intense pressure and secrecy? Did his fame after the raid, which saw him sent on a publicity tour to America, place an unfair burden on a 24-year-old? And there is the enduring mystery of his death. After the tour, he was desperate to return to combat flying against the wishes of senior commanders who saw him as too valuable a hero to risk. He was killed in a later mission in 1944. Was his death simply a tragic accident of war, or did the immense psychological strain of the dam's raid and its aftermath contribute to a lapse in judgment on that final flight? Number 12, can you keep the world's biggest secret? Operation Chastise was a mission built on secrets. The weapon was a secret, the target was a secret. The method of attack was a secret. Keeping it that way was one of the greatest challenges of the entire operation. If any details leaked, the mission would be a catastrophic failure. The Germans would strengthen the dam defenses or even lower the water levels in the reservoirs, making the bomb useless. Secrecy was not just a precaution, it was an essential component of the weapon system. The secrecy started at the very top. The project was given a high level of classification. Only a small number of senior officers and government officials knew the full picture. The scientist Barnes Wallace worked in a secure facility. His research papers and models were kept under lock and key. The development of the bomb itself was cloaked in mystery. The tests at Reculver Bay on the Kent coast were conducted in a restricted area, with armed guards patrolling the perimeter. The bomb was referred to by a code name, Upkeep. Even the workers building the casings for the bomb didn't know its true purpose. They were told they were for a project in the Middle East. The most intense secrecy surrounded number 617 Squadron. When the crews were assembled at RAF Scampton, they were told they were being formed for a special, one-off mission. They were not told what it was. The base was effectively put on lockdown. Leave was canceled. Mail was censored. The crews were forbidden from talking about their training with anyone, even their own families. They knew they were practicing low-level flying, but they didn't know why. They were practicing dropping a strange weapon over water, but they didn't know what it was for. This created a strange, isolated atmosphere on the base. The men knew they were part of something important, but the lack of information was unsettling. Rumors flew. Some thought they were going to attack the Tirpitz, a German battleship. Others thought it was a raid on submarine pens. The security measures extended to the aircraft themselves. The Lancasters were modified in secret hangars. The special equipment like the spinning mechanism for the bomb and the two spotlights for height measurement was covered up whenever the planes were outside. Even the ground crews who serviced the aircraft were not told the full story. They just followed their orders, fitting strange new pieces of equipment whose purpose they could only guess at. This is a testament to the discipline of the Royal Air Force. Thousands of people were involved in the project in some way, from the factory workers who made the bomb casings to the mechanics who serviced the planes. Yet, the secret held. There is no evidence that any significant information reached the German intelligence services before the raid. The final briefing, just hours before takeoff on the night of May 16th, was the first time that the ordinary aircrews were told their targets. Guy Gibson and Barnes Wallace revealed the plan in a locked briefing room. They used models of the dams to show the crews what they had to do. They explained how the bomb worked, why they had to fly at exactly 60 feet, and why the backspin was so important. For the crews, it was the moment when all the strange, repetitive, and dangerous training finally made sense. The secrecy had been a heavy burden, but it had worked. The German defenses at the dams were not on high alert. They were not expecting an attack of this kind. The element of surprise, so carefully protected for months, was a key ingredient in the raid's success. As documented in books like Max Hastings' Chastise, The Dambusters Story, the level of need-to-know discipline was extraordinary even by wartime standards. However, some mysteries about the secrecy remain. Were there any close calls or near leaks that were successfully covered up and never made it into the official records? How did the German intelligence services, which were generally very effective, completely miss the signs of such a large and unusual operation being prepared? And what was the psychological toll on the men of 617 Squadron living in a state of isolated uncertainty for months, knowing only that they were being trained for a mission from which many of them might not return? Number 11. Who do you pick to fly into a wall of fire? You know, you can have the best bomb in the world, but it's useless without the right people to deliver it. The demands of Operation Chastise were so extreme that no existing squadron was deemed suitable. A new one had to be created, and it had to be composed of the very best. This was the genesis of number 617 Squadron. The task of forming it, as we've seen, fell to Guy Gibson. The process began in late March 1943. The call went out across Bomber Command for experienced crews who were willing to volunteer for a hazardous but unspecified mission. The criteria were strict. The pilots had to have completed at least one full tour of operations, which was typically 30 missions. This meant they were already veterans, they had proven they could handle the immense stress of combat flying. They were survivors. But experience alone was not enough. They also needed to have a reputation for exceptional skill, particularly in low-level flying. Bomber Command kept detailed records on all its crews, and these were scoured for pilots who had a knack for flying on the deck. Navigators had to be experts at dead reckoning, the art of navigating by map, compass, and stopwatch. As bomb emmers needed to be cool-headed and precise. In total, 21 crews were selected. They were a cross-section of the Allied Air Forces. There were men from Great Britain, but also a large number of Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders. There was even one American, Joe McCarthy, who was flying with the Royal Canadian Air Force. He and his crew would go on to attack the Sorpe Dam. The crews were pulled from their existing squadrons and ordered to report to RAF Scampton. They arrived, often with little notice, to find themselves part of a new elite unit. The squadron was officially formed on March 21st, 1943. They had less than 8 weeks to prepare for the raid. The training was intense and highly specialized. The primary skill they had to master was low-level flying over water at night. This is one of the most difficult and dangerous types of flying. At night, over a smooth surface like water, it is very easy to lose your sense of height. A moment's inattention can cause the aircraft to clip the surface with catastrophic results. The crews practiced for hours over reservoirs and coastal areas in Britain. They were ordered to fly at 150 feet, then 100 feet, and finally, as the raid drew closer, at just 60 feet. They had to learn to trust their instruments, and the new spotlight altimeter more than their own senses. They also had to practice dropping the bomb. At first, they used dummy bombs. They had to learn the exact sequence, the approach speed, the height, the spin-up of the bomb, and the release. The Lancaster was a heavy bomber, not a nimble fighter. Maneuvering it with the precision required took immense skill and physical strength. The training was not without cost. Several aircraft were damaged, and crews had narrow escapes during these practice runs. The pressure was constant. The crews knew they were being trained for something big, and the risk was part of the daily routine. The formation of 617 Squadron was an exercise in creating a team of specialists. They were not just bomber crews, they were the human component of a complex weapon system. They were the interface between Barnes-Wallace's brilliant idea and the hard reality of the target. Their selection and training were just as critical to the mission's success as the design of the bomb itself. As detailed in the squadron's official operations record book, a document held in the UK National Archives, the training schedule was punishing, with flights scheduled day and night to simulate all possible conditions. But what do we not know about this elite group? What were the conversations like in the mess halls at night, among men who knew they were being pushed to the absolute limit for a reason they couldn't share? How many crews were considered for the squadron but rejected, and why? And was there any dissent or doubt among the chosen crews about the feasibility of the mission, or was the discipline and trust in their commander, Guy Gibson, absolute? Number 10. How can two pieces of wood aim a 4-ton bomb? The problem of height was solved with spotlights, but there was another, equally difficult problem: distance. The bomb had to be released at a very specific distance from the dam wall for it to skip the correct number of times and sink in the right place. For the Moan Dam, the release point was about 425 yards from the target. How could a bombardier in a vibrating aircraft, moving at 240 miles per hour in the dark, possibly know when he was at that exact spot? The standard bomb sight used in Lancasters was designed for high-altitude bombing. It was useless for this kind of low-level precision attack. The solution was not a complex piece of electronics. It was a simple, ingenious device made of wood and string. It was essentially a handheld bomb sight, a Y-shaped piece of wood that looked like a catapult or a slingshot. The bombardier would look through a peephole at the base of the IY. At the end of the two arms of the IY were two small nails or pins. To aim, the bombardier would line up the two pins with two specific features on the target. For the Moan and Eater dams, the targets were the towers that stood at either end of the dam wall. The geometry was simple but brilliant. The bombardier would hold the sight at a fixed distance from his eye. As the Lancaster flew towards the dam, the two towers would appear to get farther apart. The bombardier would watch the towers through the sight. When the top of the left tower lined up with the left-hand pin, and the top of the right tower lined up with the right-hand pin, that was the moment of perfect alignment. That was the release point. At that precise instant, the aircraft was at the correct distance from the dam. The bombardier would shout, "Bomb gone," and release the weapon. This simple tool was developed during the frantic weeks of training. Different designs were tested. The final version was created by a wing commander named Dan. It was a perfect example of appropriate technology. It was cheap, easy to make, and it worked. It required no power, had no moving parts to break, and could be used by someone under immense pressure. It relied on a basic principle of trigonometry. The sight, the bombardier's eye, and the two towers on the dam formed two similar triangles. When the angles matched, the distances were correct. The length of the arms of the Y-shaped sight and the distance between the pins were calculated based on the known distance between the towers on the dams. This information came from pre-war tourist maps and reconnaissance photos. The use of this device highlights the strange mix of old and new technology in the raid. The Lancaster was one of the most advanced bombers of its time. The upkeep bomb was a revolutionary piece of physics and engineering. Yet, the final piece of the puzzle, the device that ensured the bomb was dropped in the right place, was a tool that could have been made in a high school woodwork class. It was a victory for simplicity. In the heat of battle, with anti-aircraft fire all around, the last thing a bombardier needed was a complex piece of equipment to operate. He needed something simple, reliable, and intuitive. The wooden bomb sight was all of those things. It was a humble but absolutely critical piece of the puzzle. The account of its development is a small but important part of the official Air Ministry files on the raid, showing how even the smallest details were subject to intense problem solving. But some details about this simple device are still unclear. How many different prototypes were made and tested before they settled on the final Y-shaped design? Were other, more complex mechanical or optical solutions proposed and rejected in favor of the simpler tool? And how much practice did the bombardiers need to become proficient with this unique aiming method, a skill that no other airman in the world had to learn? Number 9, can two lights tell you? You're 60 feet high? Old Barnes Wallace's calculations were unforgiving. For his bouncing bomb to work, it had to be dropped from an exact height 60 feet. If it was dropped from too high, it would hit the water too hard and the casing would break apart. If it was dropped from too low, it would not skip enough times and would detonate before it reached the dam. But how can a pilot flying a 30-ton bomber at night at 240 miles per hour know if they are at 60 feet? The standard altimeter in an aircraft measures height above sea level based on barometric pressure. It is not accurate enough for this kind of precision work close to the ground. A radar altimeter, which measures height by bouncing radio waves off the surface, was a new technology and was not widely available or reliable enough. A new solution was needed. It was a problem that stumped the engineers for a while. The answer, when it came, was brilliantly simple. It came from a man named Ben Lockspizer, a scientist at the Ministry of Aircraft Production. He suggested using two spotlights, one mounted under the nose of the aircraft and another under the tail. The spotlights were angled inwards so that their beams would cross at a certain point below the aircraft. The geometry was precise. When the aircraft was at exactly 60 feet above the water, the two circles of light from the spotlights would merge into a single figure 8 shape on the surface. The pilot didn't have to look at an instrument on his dashboard. He just had to look out of his side window at the surface of the water. If he saw two separate circles of light, he was too high. He had to descend. If the circles of light had crossed over each other and were moving apart again, he was too low. He had to climb. If he saw a single, perfectly formed figure 8, his height was exactly 60 feet. He had to hold the aircraft there, rock steady, all the way to the release point. This was the flight engineer's job, too, to help the pilot maintain that perfect altitude. It was an incredibly clever solution to a life-or-death problem. It turned a difficult question of measurement into a simple visual test. The idea was tested over water in the UK. The crews found it worked perfectly. It was simple, intuitive, and accurate. The spotlights were standard landing lights, so they were readily available. The only modification needed was to build special fairings to mount them at the correct angle. Like the wooden bomb sight, it was a low-tech solution to a high-tech problem. It also had an unintended consequence. On the night of the raid, the spotlights made the Lancasters highly visible to the German gunners. Flying towards the dam with two bright lights pointing down at the water was like painting a target on your own aircraft. It was another risk that the crews had to accept. The trade-off was clear be seen and have a chance of hitting the target, or fly in darkness and have no chance at all. The engineering drawings for these spotlight modifications, preserved in aviation archives, are a testament to this simple, elegant solution. Yet, there are still things we don't fully understand. Who first came up with the specific idea of angling the lights to form a figure 8, a concept that provided such an unambiguous visual cue? Were other optical methods, perhaps using mirrors or prisms, considered before settling on the simple spotlight system? And how difficult was it for the pilots to divide their attention between flying the aircraft, watching the target ahead, and glancing out the side window to monitor the lights on the water, all while being shot at? Number 8, how do you navigate without GPS? Today, we can pinpoint our location anywhere on Earth using a satellite signal. In 1943, there was no GPS. There was no satellite navigation. There was not even a reliable system of radio beacons to guide a bomber to a target deep inside enemy territory. For the crews of 617 Squadron, finding a specific dam in the middle of a dark, hostile country was a monumental challenge of navigation. They had to do it the old-fashioned way, a technique known as dead reckoning. Dead reckoning is the art of calculating your position by using a previously determined position or a fix, and then incorporating estimations of speed, direction, and time. The navigator on a Lancaster crew was a master of this art. His tools were simple: a map, a compass, a stopwatch, and an instrument to measure wind speed and direction. The flight plan was meticulously prepared before takeoff. It was a series of legs, each with a specific heading, speed, and duration. The navigator's job was to keep the aircraft on this invisible track. The raid was planned to take place on a night with a full moon. This was not for romantic reasons. The moonlight was essential for navigation. The crews were flying so low that they couldn't see the stars to navigate by. They had to see the ground. They had to be able to identify landmarks like rivers, forests, and railway lines. This was called map reading, and it was the primary way they confirmed their position. The navigator would be crouched over his map table, lit by a dim light, trying to match the features he could see on the ground with the symbols on his map. He would constantly be giving the pilot small course corrections. Turn 2 degrees to port, hold this heading for 3 more minutes. Flying at 60 feet made navigation even harder. From that low altitude, your field of view is very limited. You can't see distant landmarks. You only see what is right in front of you, and it is rushing past at 240 miles per hour. A small hill or a patch of forest can hide a crucial turning point until you are right on top of it. The crews were routed to avoid known concentrations of anti-aircraft guns and major cities. This meant their flight paths were often a zigzag series of doglegs through a landscape of dark fields and sleeping villages. It required intense, continuous concentration from the entire crew, especially the navigator and the pilot. Some of the crews got lost. The flat, featureless terrain of the Netherlands was particularly difficult to navigate at low level. One aircraft, flying too low, struck the sea and lost its bomb, but managed to return home. Another was shot down by coastal defenses. The journey to the dams was a life-and-death struggle before the attack had even begun. The success of the majority of the crews in finding their small, specific targets in the vastness of nighttime Europe is a testament to the incredible skill of the navigators. They were the unsung heroes of the raid. Without their quiet, methodical work at the back of the aircraft, the pilots would have been flying blind. The original flight plans and navigators' logs from the mission, some of which survived, are now museum pieces, showing the intricate web of calculations and observations needed to cross a continent in the dark. But there are gaps in our knowledge of the navigational feat. How much did the crews rely on unofficial, local knowledge of the landscape, perhaps gleaned from pre-war travel or geographical surveys? We know the official route, but did any navigators use secret tricks or personal techniques to stay on course? And for the crews who were shot down far from their intended track, what were the specific navigational errors that led them into danger, and were they the result of human error, equipment malfunction, or simply bad luck? Number 7. Why fly so low you could hit a tree? The standard image of a World War II bomber is of an aircraft flying in formation at 20,000 feet, high above the clouds. The Lancasters of 617 Squadron flew their mission at 60 feet. That's about the height of a 5-story building. It was a ridiculously low and dangerous altitude. Why did they have to do it? There were 2 main reasons, and both were critical to the mission. The first reason was the weapon itself. As Barnes-Wallace had calculated, the upkeep mine had to be dropped from 60 feet. This was a strict requirement of the physics involved. Flying at this height was not a choice. It was a fundamental part of the plan. But there was a second, equally important reason: survival. The best way to avoid being detected by enemy radar in 1943 was to fly below its beams. German radar stations were designed to pick up high and medium altitude bombers. Their radio waves traveled in straight lines. By flying at treetop height, the Lancasters could use the curvature of the earth and the clutter of the landscape hills, forests, and buildings a dance to hide from the radar operators. It was called flying under the radar, a phrase that has since entered common language. This low-level approach meant that the bombers could penetrate deep into enemy territory without raising a general alarm. The German air defense system was a sophisticated network of radar stations, listening posts, and fighter bases. A formation of high-altitude bombers would have been detected hundreds of miles away, and fighter aircraft would have been sent to intercept them. By flying low, the dam busters hoped to achieve tactical surprise, arriving over their targets before the defenses were fully alerted. But it was incredibly dangerous. At that heightened speed, there is no margin for error. A moment of inattention, a sudden downdraft of air, or an unexpected obstacle could be fatal. The pilots had to be constantly vigilant. They had to fly over high-tension power lines, which were often invisible in the dark until the last second. Several aircraft had close calls with these wires. One aircraft, piloted by the Australian Les Munro, had its communications completely knocked out by a bird strike. The landscape itself was a threat. The flight path took them over forests and rolling hills. The pilots had to constantly adjust their altitude to avoid hitting the ground. It was physically and mentally exhausting. The book The Dam Busters Raid by John Sweetman provides detailed analysis of the flight paths and the extreme challenges of this low-level flight. The skill required from the pilots was immense. They were not just flying a straight line, they were navigating a complex three-dimensional obstacle course in the dark. The success of the mission depended on their ability to maintain this intense focus for hours on end. The low-level flight was a double-edged sword. It was the key to their survival and to the correct delivery of the weapon, but it was also a constant nerve-wracking danger that threatened to destroy them at any moment. It was a calculated risk, and it was a risk that all the crews accepted as part of the job, but many questions about this aspect of the raid are still debated. How much did pre-war civilian flight experience, where pilots often flew lower, contribute to the skills of the top pilots chosen for 617 Squadron? Were there any undocumented crashes or accidents during the intensive low-level training phase that were kept out of official reports to maintain morale? And finally, what was the physiological and psychological impact on the pilots of flying for hours under such intense strain? And did it contribute to fatigue-related errors on the return journey? Number 6. How do you fit a giant spinning bomb under a plane? The Avro Lancaster was the workhorse of Bomber Command. It was a brilliant aircraft capable of carrying a huge bomb load over long distances. But it was designed to carry a variety of conventional bombs stored inside a long enclosed bomb bay. Barnes-Wallace's upkeep, mine was not a conventional bomb. It was a huge cylindrical object, over 60 inches in diameter. It was far too big to fit inside the Lancaster standard bomb bay. This presented a major engineering problem. The solution was not elegant. It was a case of brute force modification. The bomb bay doors of the Lancaster had to be completely removed. This left a huge open space in the belly of the aircraft. The bomb itself was to be held in place by two V-shaped arms or calipers. When it was time to drop the bomb, these arms would swing open, releasing the mine, but the problem was more complex than just taking the doors off. The bomb bay doors are part of the structural integrity of the aircraft's fuselage. Removing them weakened the whole airframe. The Lancaster had to be specially strengthened to compensate. Extra bracing and structural members were added to ensure the plane wouldn't break apart under the strain of flight, especially during the violent maneuvers of low-level flying. Then there was the problem of the spin. A key part of Wallace's design was that the bomb had to be spinning backward at 500 revolutions per minute before it was dropped. This backspin was crucial for making it skip across the water and for keeping it pressed against the dam wall as it sank. To achieve this, a special drive mechanism had to be designed and fitted to the aircraft. A hydraulic motor was mounted inside the fuselage. This motor was connected via a belt drive to a pulley on the side of the bomb. Just before the bombing run, the bombardier would switch on this motor, which would spin the 4-ton mine up to the required speed. The whole aircraft would vibrate from the force of this huge spinning object in its belly. These modifications were carried out in secret at a special facility at Woodford, near Manchester. A dedicated team of engineers and mechanics worked around the clock to convert the small batch of Lancasters that had been allocated to the new squadron. The modified aircraft was given a special designation, Lancaster B Mark III Special. Each modification had to be tested. The release mechanism had to work perfectly every time, the spinning motor had to be reliable, the strengthened airframe had to be safe. It was a race against time. The raid was scheduled for May, to take advantage of high water levels in the dams. The modifications had to be completed and tested by then. The detailed plans for these modifications, known as Modification 464, show the extent of the structural changes required. It was like performing major surgery on an aircraft that was already a complex piece of machinery. The result was a unique, specialized weapon system, a hybrid of a bomber and a piece of custom-built artillery. But some of the engineering specifics are not widely known. What were the biggest technical failures or setbacks during the modification and testing phase at Woodford, and how were they overcome? Were there any alternative designs for the bomb release mechanism or the spinning drive that were considered and rejected? And how did the removal of the bomb bay doors and the addition of the heavy mine and its equipment affect the Lancaster's flight characteristics, and what new skills did the pilots have to learn to handle this modified beast? Number 5. Why these dams and not others? The choice of target is one of the most important decisions in any military operation. For Operation Chastise, the targets were 3 dams in the heart of Germany's industrial region, the Ruhr Valley. They were the Möhne, the Eder, and the Sorpe. But why were these specific dams chosen? The answer lies in a strategy of economic warfare. The goal was not just to blow up a structure, it was to cripple the engine of the German war machine. The Ruhr Valley was the industrial powerhouse of Germany. It was packed with coal mines, steelworks, and factories that produced everything from tanks to ammunition. This vast industrial complex required 2 things above all else: power and water. Water was needed for generating hydroelectric power. It was needed for cooling the blast furnaces used to make steel. It was also essential for the canal systems that were used to transport raw materials and finished goods. The entire industrial ecosystem of the Ruhr depended on a reliable, managed water supply. That supply was controlled by a series of large dams built in the surrounding hills. British intelligence, specifically the Ministry of Economic Warfare, had identified these dams as a critical vulnerability. An official at the ministry, a man named Rex Pearson, had written a paper in 1937, long before the war, highlighting the strategic importance of the Ruhr dams. In Barnes Wallis himself, in his 1941 paper, A Note on a Method of Attacking the Axis Powers, had identified dams as a prime target for a new type of weapon. He argued that destroying a single dam could cause far more disruption than destroying hundreds of individual factories. It was an attack on the system, not just the components. The Möhne and Eder dams were selected as the primary targets. The Möhne dam held back the largest reservoir and directly supplied water to a huge number of industries. The Eder dam was also massive, and although it was less directly involved in industrial supply, its role was to regulate the water level in the major rivers and canals. Breaching, it would cause widespread flooding and disrupt shipping for hundreds of miles. These 2 dams were both of a type known as gravity dams. They relied on their immense weight to hold back the water. Wallis's calculations showed that this type of dam was vulnerable to a large underwater explosion placed directly against its wall. The Sorpe dam was a secondary target. It was a different type of structure, an earthen dam with a concrete core. It was much harder to break. Wallis knew that his bouncing bomb would not be effective against the Sorpe's sloping sides. The plan for this target was different. The crews attacking the Sorpe would have to fly along the length of the dam and drop their bomb, without spinning it, directly onto the center of the wall. It was a much harder task, and the chances of success were lower. But the Sorpe was an important part of the water system, so it was included in the plan. The selection of these targets was the result of years of careful analysis. It was a cold, calculated decision based on maps, economic data, and engineering principles. It was a new kind of warfare, where the goal was to collapse an enemy's economy by striking at its most critical infrastructure. But the process of target selection still holds some mysteries. Were other dams in Europe considered as potential targets before the focus settled on the Ruhr Valley? How much did the specific design of the Möhne Dam, with its prominent towers that could be used for aiming, influence its selection as the top priority? And was there any debate within the high command about the potential for massive civilian casualties downstream? And if so, how was that debate resolved? Number 4. Could a marble really predict a flood? Barnes Wallis was a man of science. His idea for a bouncing bomb was not a wild guess. It was based on physics, mathematics, and most importantly, experimentation. But you can't test a 4-ton bomb by just dropping it from a plane. It's too expensive and too dangerous. Wallace had to be sure his theory was correct before he could build the real thing. To do that, he turned to the power of models. He became a master of small-scale experimentation. His early experiments were famously simple. He used his daughter's marbles in a tin tub in his own backyard. He would flick the marbles across the water to see how they skipped. This was how he first got a feel for the basic principles. But to convince the authorities, he needed more than a backyard experiment. He needed hard data. He gained access to more sophisticated testing facilities. One of the most important was at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington. Here, in a large water tank used for testing ship hulls, he could conduct more controlled experiments. He used models of bombs made of wood and other materials and a catapult system to launch them across the water at precise speeds and angles. He discovered that a sphere was not the ideal shape. A spherical bomb tended to bounce too high and unpredictably. A cylindrical shape, a bomb that looked like a large drum or barrel, was much more stable. He also refined the idea of backspin. He found that by spinning the cylinder backward before it hit the water, he could create a hydrodynamic effect that kept the bomb skipping low across the surface. This was a critical discovery. The backspin also helped to pull the bomb towards the dam wall after the final skip. The most famous and visually striking experiments were the ones to test the bomb's effect on the dam itself. These were conducted at the Road Research Laboratory near Harmondsworth. The engineers there built a precise 1/50th scale model of the Moan Dam. It was about 40 feet long and made of special cement and mortar, designed to have the same relative strength as the real dam. They filled a tank with water to simulate the reservoir. Then, using small charges of explosive equivalent in scale to the 4 tons of high explosive in the real bomb, they tested Wallace's theory. They placed the charge at various distances and depths to find the optimal position for the explosion. The experiments confirmed Wallace's calculations. A charge detonated at a certain depth, right up against the face of the dam, would create a shock wave that would be focused by the water pressure and the curved shape of the dam, leading to a catastrophic structural failure. These small-scale tests were absolutely essential. They allowed Wallace to refine his design and prove his concept without risking a single aircraft or life. It was a perfect example of the scientific method applied to a military problem. The journey from a marble in a tin tub to a 4-ton weapon was a story of careful, methodical, and ingenious experimentation. The data from these model tests formed the scientific backbone of the entire operation, but the history of these experiments is not complete. What were some of the key failures and dead ends in Wallace's model testing that forced him to rethink his designs? We know about the successes, but what about the ideas that didn't work? How much did he rely on the uncredited work of junior engineers and technicians at the research facilities to conduct the thousands of repetitive tests needed to gather the data? And how certain were the scientists that the results from a small-scale model dam would accurately predict the behavior of the real massive structure? Was there still a significant element of guesswork involved? Number 3, how do you make a bomb that skips? The central problem of the raid was how to destroy a massive dam. A conventional bomb dropped from a high altitude would be inaccurate. Even if it hit the water, it would lose most of its momentum and probably detonate harmlessly. A torpedo, the standard weapon for attacking targets on water, would be stopped by the heavy torpedo nets that protected the dams. Barnes-Wallace's solution was to invent a weapon that behaved like nothing else before it. He created a bomb that could fly. The official name for the weapon was the upkeep rotating mine, but everyone knew it as the bouncing bomb. The design was the result of all the testing with models. It was a metal cylinder about 50 inches in diameter and 60 inches long. It was filled with 6,600 pounds of a powerful explosive called Torpex. The casing was specially designed to withstand the immense impact of hitting the water at over 200 miles per hour. The key to its success was a combination of 3 clever ideas. First was the shape and the delivery. It was dropped from a very low altitude, 60 feet, and at a specific speed, 240 miles per hour. This meant it hit the water at a very shallow angle, which is the first requirement for making an object skip, just like a flat stone thrown across a lake. Second was the backspin. Before it was dropped, the bomb was spun up to 500 revolutions per minute. This backspin was the secret ingredient. It created a phenomenon known as the Magnus effect, the same principle that makes a golf ball with backspin fly higher and farther. For the bomb, the backspin created a small amount of lift, which helped it to make long, low skips across the surface of the water, preventing it from digging in. This allowed it to travel the several hundred yards needed to reach the dam wall and to clear the torpedo nets. The third was the fuse. The bomb couldn't just explode on impact, it had to sink to a specific depth before it detonated. The greatest pressure, and therefore the greatest destructive force, would be at the base of the dam. The upkeep was fitted with 3 hydrostatic fuses. These are devices that use water pressure to trigger a detonation. They were set to go off when the bomb had sunk to a depth of 30 feet. The backspin had a final, clever role to play here. As the bomb hit the dam wall, its spin would cause it to run down the wall, keeping it pressed tight against the concrete as it sank. This ensured that when it did explode, all its energy was directed into the structure of the dam. The development of upkeep was a process of trial and error. Full-scale, inert prototypes were dropped from aircraft at a special test range at Reculver Bay on the coast of Kent. The early versions broke apart on impact. The spin rate had to be adjusted. The release mechanism had to be perfected. Each test flight provided valuable data that was fed back to Wallace and his team. The project was under immense pressure. There was a tight deadline, and there were many skeptics in the military establishment who thought the whole idea was a waste of time and resources. But Wallace persevered. The final result was a weapon of incredible ingenuity, a perfect marriage of physics, engineering, and military necessity. It was a solution to a problem that many had thought was unsolvable, but key questions about its invention remain. Who were the unsung engineers and metallurgists who solved the critical problem of creating a casing strong enough to survive the initial impact with the water? Were any other explosive compounds besides Torpex considered, and why was it chosen? And what happened to all the failed prototypes and the data from the unsuccessful tests? Are there still lessons to be learned from Wallace's mistakes as well as his successes? Number 2, did the whole idea start with a cannonball? Every great invention has an origin story. For the bouncing bomb, that story begins not in a laboratory, but in the history books. Barnes Wallace was a student of history as well as an engineer. He was fascinated by the stories of naval warfare in the Age of Sail. He was particularly interested in the techniques used by Admiral Horatio Nelson, the great British naval hero of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In Nelson's time, naval cannons fired simple, round iron cannonballs. One of the techniques used by skilled gunners was to fire their cannons at a low angle, aiming for the water just in front of an enemy ship. The cannonball would not sink immediately. It would skip off the surface of the water like a stone and hit the enemy ship's hull at the waterline. This was a devastatingly effective tactic. A hole at the waterline was much more dangerous than a hole in the masts or sails. This historical anecdote lodged itself in Wallace's mind. The idea of using the surface of the water as part of a weapon's trajectory was a powerful one. This historical inspiration combined with a modern problem. In the early years of the Second World War, Wallace was obsessed with finding a way to destroy major strategic targets, like dams and heavily fortified structures. He knew that a very large explosion was needed. He initially proposed a massive 10-ton earthquake bomb to be dropped from a very high altitude. The idea was that the bomb would penetrate deep into the ground before exploding, creating a shock wave that would destroy the target's foundations. The Air Ministry rejected this idea. There was no bomber at the time that could carry such a heavy weapon to the required altitude. So Wallace went back to the drawing board. He was still thinking about how to deliver a large explosive charge to a precise point. He remembered the story of Nelson skipping cannonballs. What if he could apply the same principle to a bomb? He began to think about a spherical bomb, a bouncing bomb, that could be dropped from a low-flying aircraft. It would skip over defenses like torpedo nets and deliver its explosive charge directly to the base of a dam or the side of a battleship. This was the conceptual leap that led to Operation Chastise. The initial idea, as laid out in his early papers, was for a spherical weapon. The spherical shape was the most direct link to the historical cannonball. It was only through later experimentation, as we've seen, that he discovered a cylinder was a more stable and effective shape. But the core concept, the skip core, came directly from that piece of naval history. It was a brilliant example of how an idea from the past can be reimagined to solve a problem of the present. The story highlights the nature of Wallace's genius. He was not just an engineer who could solve equations. He was a creative thinker who could see connections between seemingly unrelated things. He saw a link between an 18th century cannonball and a 20th century strategic bomber. It was this ability to think outside the box that allowed him to come up with a solution that nobody else had even considered. But the exact moment of inspiration is hard to pin down. Did Wallace have a single eureka moment, or was the idea a gradual evolution from his study of naval tactics? How much did other historical examples of ricochet fire from other periods and other armies influence his thinking? And were there any other engineers or scientists at the time who were exploring similar unconventional ideas whose work has been overshadowed by Wallace's singular success? Number one, was it all just one man's obsession? At the heart of the Dam Buster story is one man, Barnes Wallace. Without his vision, his intellect, and, above all, his stubborn persistence, the raid would never have happened. The entire operation was a testament to the power of a single, determined individual to overcome a mountain of skepticism and technical challenges. Wallace was an engineer at the Vickers Armstrong's Aircraft Company. He had been a key designer of airships in the 1920s and had developed the geodetic construction method used in the successful Wellington bomber. He was a brilliant and innovative thinker, but he was also considered something of an eccentric. His idea for a bouncing bomb was not immediately embraced by the military establishment. And in fact, it was met with widespread ridicule. Senior officers in the Royal Air Force and the government thought it was a fantasy. They called it barmy and a waste of resources. The official files from the period, now declassified, are full of memos from high-ranking officials dismissing Wallace's proposals. They argued that the idea was impractical, that no pilot could fly with the required precision, and that the bomb would never work as advertised. The head of Bomber Command, Air Marshal Arthur Harris, was particularly skeptical. He was focused on a strategy of area bombing and saw Wallace's project as a distraction. But Wallace refused to give up. He was driven by a powerful conviction that he was right. He wrote paper after paper filled with meticulous calculations and drawings. He built models and conducted experiments, often using his own money at first. He lobbied anyone who would listen, from junior civil servants to senior air marshals. He was a relentless advocate for his idea. He faced setback after setback. Committees were formed to evaluate his work, and they often came back with negative reports. At one point, the project was officially canceled, but Wallace used his connections and the power of his arguments to get it reinstated. The turning point came when a film of his model tests, showing a small bomb skipping successfully across the water of a test tank, was shown to Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, the Chief of the Air Staff. Portal was a more open-minded leader than Harris. He saw the potential in Wallace's idea and decided to give it his backing. This was the crucial breakthrough. With Portal's support, the project was given the green light and the resources it needed. But even then, the opposition did not disappear. Wallace had to fight for every piece of equipment, every hour of test time, and every aircraft allocated to the project. Wallace's role was not just that of an inventor. He was a project manager, a salesman, and a political operator. He had to navigate the complex and often hostile bureaucracy of the wartime government. His personal diaries and letters from the period reveal a man under immense stress, often despairing at the short-sightedness of the officials he had to deal with. But he never lost faith in his idea. This single-minded determination is perhaps the most incredible feat of all. Before a single piece of metal was cut, or a single pilot was chosen, the battle had to be won in the committee rooms and offices of Whitehall. It was a battle fought with slide rules, blueprints, and sheer force of will, and it was a battle that Barnes Wallace, the obsessive, brilliant engineer, won almost single-handedly. Yet, even with a figure as well documented as Wallace, there are still profound questions. How much of his legendary persistence was driven by scientific conviction, and how much was driven by a personal need to prove his critics wrong, especially after the personal tragedy he suffered with the R-101 airship disaster years earlier? Who were his key, often uncredited, allies within the bureaucracy who helped him keep the project alive during its darkest days? And finally, if Barnes Wallace had given up after the first or second or 10th rejection, how different would the history of aerial warfare and the story of the Second World War itself have been?